Okay, welcome everyone to the Hayes Ireland DE&I Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Report 2023. It's great to have you here today and join us for key findings, update and a panel discussion afterwards. So before we start, diversity, equity and inclusion is not static. It's an ongoing narrative of progress, transformation and societal evolution. Its principles are not just buzzwords, they're the foundation of a vibrant, healthy and successful organisation. They represent a commitment to embracing and celebrating the richness of human differences, ensuring that everyone, regardless of our background, can thrive and contribute to our fullest potential. Historically, DE&I issues were often neglected or intentionally ignored in the workplace potentially, but the recognition of the need to change started with the emergence of specialised DE&I roles within organisations. These roles initially focused on compliance, addressing legal requirements. However, they soon evolved into champions of more holistic approach to DE&I. And over time, the world of DE&I has evolved, going from the right thing to do to the smart thing to do. And in recent years, marked by societal movements and shifts in public consciousness, events like civil rights movements, women's liberation, and more recently, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ+ rights movements have brought the DE&I issues to the forefront of public discourse. So these pivotal moments challenged and continue to challenge organisations to rethink and refine their approach to diversity and inclusion. Today, DE&I is woven into the fabric of recruitment, retention, leadership development, and decision-making. It's become a global imperative for organisations and leaders. And organisations understand that the DE&I practices must be adapted to diverse cultural contexts while upholding fundamental principles of fairness and equity. And companies that fail to meet these expectations risk reputational damage and economic consequences. So our DE&I report launched today in Ireland is reflective of the role that businesses play in shaping a more equitable and inclusive workplace and society. So thank you and welcome to everybody who's joined the launch of our Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Report today, 2023. Before I go and introduce the panel and have the panel discussion, I would like, if we could move through the report, I want to share some of the key findings with you. And as I said, the report will be available to download after the webinar finishes, so around 1 o'clock onwards today to get the full report. So the first slide here is the key themes that came through. So having the confidence to be yourselves at work, having the confidence to speak about DE&I, the disconnect between perceptions, and that's between managers and non-people managers, the need to shift conversation to action, and having the confidence to challenge exclusionary behaviour. So within the world of work, the perceived barriers to progression remain very much part of people's lived experience. Almost a quarter of respondents don't currently feel that they have the same opportunities as their peers when it comes to succeeding within their organisation, a feeling that only increases the older respondents become. And again, I look forward to discussing this with the panel. Along with over a third of respondents say that they have felt the need to hide an aspect of who they are for the fear of judgment by others. And I suppose here that highlights the extent of to which so many people cover at work. And cover is a term that was originally coined by a sociologist called Erwin Goffman. And covering is the act of playing down aspects of who you are in the workplace for the fear of judgment. And in this context, it's driven by the pressure to conform to corporate norms. So again, I'm going to it'll be really interesting to have a conversation because that's quite a significant amount of people that are covering while they're at work. And then research is telling us that hierarchy has a clear impact on how people feel about challenging exclusionary behaviour at work. Over 2/3 of people, managers said, they felt confident challenging this behaviour among senior members of the organisation, however, compared with only 51% of non-people managers. And then the vast majority of people managers felt confident challenging exclusionary behaviour amongst the wider members of the organisation, but this sentiment was more reserved for non-people managers. And then if we move to conversations and acknowledging easy and open conversations around a topic that is as nuanced and as complex as DE&I is not without its challenges. And somewhat ironically, a fear of seeming to be inauthentic or insincere can deter people from engaging in serious discussions with employees on the subject. And I suppose these are vital conversations that could go a long way towards increasing people's understanding of each other, often don't take place, which could be very impactful if they did. Over half of people managers who took our survey agree that they feel comfortable engaging in conversations around DE&I that they have little knowledge of. However, there's only just 15% that feel very comfortable. And then of those that don't feel comfortable, over half are worried about making a mistake and imparting incorrect information. And then 27% are fearful of giving offense to someone. So this data highlights the lack of what I suppose could be described as psychological safety among key manager populations. The fear of being criticized for making an error or using the wrong language is resulting in managers feeling the need to stay silent or withdraw potentially from the conversation on DE&I. And I suppose this is a problem, because if we want to promote cultures of inclusion, we need all colleagues, including managers, to feel that they can openly engage and participate in DE&I conversations. And then, of course, creating a culture of psychological safety is critical to encouraging more open discussions around DE&I in the workplace, which means people should not feel afraid to make honest mistakes. 2/3 of people feel that they have the space in their organisation to make an honest mistake when discussing DE&I issues, so that's positive. But that confidence does diminish the older respondents get. And we can see here that 69% of under 40s feel they have the space to make an honest mistake in comparison to 64% of those over the age of 40. And then if we move to the final slide at this part of our launch, so though 2/3 of non-people managers feel comfortable raising concerns that they have around DE&I in to their managers, confidence that this will be actually translated into meaningful change is actually more muted. Okay, so while they're comfortable raising concerns, the action piece is potentially missing. So only 61% are confident that they will be listened to and actions will be taken. So again, the data suggests that while there is currently some capacity to open discussion around DE&I concerns within organisations, more needs to be done to facilitate that honest conversation and act upon them accordingly. So as I said, this report will be available at the end of our webinar today. The full report, these were only some of the key findings. So do feel free to go to hays.ie. We will have information afterwards so that you can log on and request the report. So now let's move on to the panel discussion. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Dan Robertson, MD of VERCIDA, who is the head of DE&I Advisory Service with Hays. Andrew Campbell-Edie, Communication Manager with the Irish Centre of Diversity, and Stephen McNamara, CEO of Paralympics Ireland. Welcome to you all. Great to have you here. Now, so feel free to come off mute if you wish. I think great, we could create a conversation, but we'll start with some questions. And I suppose just this is to all of you, and feel free to jump in. But just of the top line research insights, whether they're in and what you've read so far from the report, what is striking you most, and potentially why, and were you surprised by any of the findings? You're nodding, Dan. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Look, I think the findings are really interesting, actually.
Can we hear you, Dan? Sorry, we can't seem to hear Dan.
Can you hear me now? I'm off mute. You can. Fab. I think the findings are super interesting because, and for me, the main finding, which is interesting, that idea of covering. We know that companies across Ireland are doing lots of work around diversity and inclusion, and we've done lots of stuff on our policies and our processes and all that great stuff on the recruitment. We've done loads of stuff on unconscious bias. But the fact is, we've still got an overwhelming body of people that come into work every day and don't feel that they can be themselves. And so I think there's some questions around why that is. What is it about the way that we behave with each other or our corporate cultures, which says, okay, we've got our policies in place, but there's something about the culture which is projecting this idea that you can't be yourself. And that falls neatly into that inclusion space. So I think that was one of the big takeaways for me in terms of we clearly need to do much more work on inclusion as opposed to just diversity.
Okay, very interesting. And Stephen, that was one of the key areas that struck a chord with you also.
Yeah, absolutely. So just checking I can be heard there. Yeah, I guess somebody give me a thumbs up. Yeah, super, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I think on for a number of reasons, and again, even that idea of somebody hiding themselves, I think it stays with a person throughout their career. And even as I was preparing for today, you have this constant conversation in your mind. Do you share your own lived experience? And I, as a gay man, have gone through all of my career wondering when is the appropriate time to mention it. Is it at the interview stage? Is it when I get the job? Is it beforehand when you're speaking to the recruitment agent? And in some cases, it's all of those things. So in previous iterations of my life, I worked in the aviation industry. And when I was approached to work in the Middle East with an airline company, I just felt straight away that wasn't going to be for me. And that was because that company didn't feel right for me. And even though the recruitment person tried to suggest that it would be okay, that I could live with my partner as a friend, that would be okay, but that wouldn't be okay for me. But here in the Irish experience, when I have a look at my own career, previously I worked for the Irish Rugby Football Union, but I actually turned that job down originally because I felt again that maybe the organisation wasn't right for me. It had never come up during the interview stage or indeed in the recruitment at all around the diversity. And even though I had felt that rugby was probably the most diverse of the sports, when it came to it, I kind of felt that it wasn't right. Now, ultimately, I did get and take the job, having been offered it, having had a conversation again with the recruitment person, because the recruitment person clearly knew that there was some issue. She actually asked me, well, what is it that is holding you back from taking the job? And at that point, I felt the confidence and I felt the invitation was there to be open and transparent. And indeed, then when you're working in sport, it's a very male, it's a very straight-dominated industry. So you're still somewhat unusual being a gay male, or indeed maybe a female at the top end of sport. So I think all of the time when we're looking through this, and these lived experiences for me have, I suppose, illuminated that really what is required in the industry is for organizations to write, maybe job ads that are more open, to be more open about their company and their values on their website, which can feel like it's maybe already been done. I know in recent years there's been a huge drive and the Pride initiatives around the world have really taken off. And maybe companies feel, well, we're very active in Pride on Pride Day, but actually you've got to live that the whole way through. So if a person is going to be interested in an opportunity in your business, they're probably going to go onto your website. So what do they see when they go onto that website? Is it all white males of a certain age? And if it is, then they're probably not going to go for a job there, even if they are a white male of a certain age, because increasingly we're finding younger people want a more diverse workforce. So it's about understanding, I suppose, the factors that are within that, and understanding that at all stages people are unfortunately still hiding who they are, and being conscious of that from the very outset of the recruitment process, and indeed when a person comes into your organization.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Stephen. Yeah, it's really interesting. You made a number of really interesting points there. And one of them, Andrea, I might tell you again what struck you, but maybe to continue then, it's this challenge of when to share. Stephen, you felt on both occasions at the beginning of the process, but for some people, they don't feel the confidence to do that at the beginning of the process, and it could be further down. So again, have you any comment from the Centre of Diversity? Are you seeing anything, or can you add to, in your experience?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you for having us as part of today's webinar, and congratulations on the launch of the report. Data is so important in DE&I work, and we use the Hayes report quite a bit in all of our training that we do. So thank you very much for inviting us along. Now, before I kind of answer your immediate question, I just also like to point out this whole thing about hovering and what's known in the gay world. I'm a gay man, and it's known in the gay world as passing. It's worth remembering that there are more differences that are unseen than those that are seen. So whether someone's sexual orientation, their neurodiversity status, anything like that, you know, can be passed over and hidden. And so people can apply for the jobs and then have the dilemma of, do they come out? Do they share? Do they divulge an area of themselves that's stopping them from being their full selves? But so speaking personally as a Black man, I can't hide the area that I may face discrimination over, which is different to, say, a member of the LGBTQ community. You know, they may be able to pass. The same of my lived experience may go to someone who is maybe a disabled person who maybe uses a wheelchair or something like that. So this whole idea of disclosure, if you like, is it's worth remembering that not all differences, you know, can be seen. So in terms of when do you disclose, I would almost like to turn that on its head. And I'm so glad that we're having this discussion, because people shouldn't have to disclose. I mean, we at the Irish Centre for Diversity, we help organizations to create cultures that are fully inclusive and rich in diversity and inclusion, so people don't have to have these discussions, don't have to out themselves, if you like. But what we help companies to create and businesses to create is a culture where the discussions around difference and diversity can happen anywhere, and that sort of sharing, natural sharing, authentic sharing and learning naturally happens without any fear of judgment, and equally fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. You know, we would say that mistakes will happen, and when we're doing our coaching with training partners, we will always say that, you know, don't be afraid of making a mistake. A mistake is a chance to learn. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's very true. I mean, what's important is where the misstep is coming from. Is it coming from a positive place and wanting to progress, or is it judgment? And hopefully, if the culture is progressed enough, then it's never going to come from a place of culture. But to answer your question directly, you know, when should somebody disclose? The answer is disclose whenever they feel comfortable. And that may be at the beginning, could be in the middle, it may never happen. And if it's never going to happen, then that person needs to ask themselves the question, do I belong here? Why can't I divulge? Why can't I divulge? Why can't I disclose? Why am I living with this burden? It's not a burden, but why am I living with this extra thing that I'm hiding? And it's at that point, then they kind of have to ask themselves the question, should I be finding a company that is beating the drum and has embraced diversity inclusion and moving across? Because you can bet your bottom dollar that there are companies out there that are doing it. So why would a team member stay in an organization that isn't supporting them, that doesn't have that sort of welcoming, belonging environment and culture?
Yeah, it's a very good point you make, Andrew, is around that authentic, again, back to the authentic self. And Davin, go to you, you know, where that percentage of people are, you know, that went into work today, you know, that's reflective of the community we are here in Ireland, who went into work today and felt that they couldn't be 100% themselves. And that's going to impact them as in the work that they do, their own productivity, their enjoyment, the innovation they bring, the ideas they bring. You know, it does impact an organization also if your employees do not feel fully authentic, included. So Dan, potentially maybe you could explore that the impact.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think, look, I guess, you know, one question is, look, what's the end game here? And I think for me, the end game fundamentally is we just want to make sure that we've got organizations which are inclusive and we have psychological safety for no other reason that it's the right thing to do. Okay, that's the first baseline. But I think you can layer that then and say, okay, well, there are other things that we want to factor in. And I suppose, I don't really like using the term, but, you know, people talk about the business case for DE&I. And I think, you know, if there is one, then I do think there's a lot of evidence that says diversity, and this is really interesting because actually what the data tells us something very, very fascinating, which is diversity does not give us innovation or creativity. It's diversity plus inclusion. So when we get cultures which are inclusive and you can be yourself, you can contribute to those conversations and the rest of it. So if you can't be yourself, what happens? So from a psychological and neurological level, when you go into work and you're hiding who you are, you actually literally start to experience mental trauma. And that actually has a profound effect in terms of your health, your well-being, your neurology. So if we want individuals to, contribute to conversations, to be creative, be supportive, lean into the corporate culture, it's very difficult for individuals to do that. And it's difficult for individuals to be high performing when they're under this idea of what's called cognitive load. It just doesn't happen. So when you've got one person doing that, that has actually quite a particular impact in terms of the team. And actually, it's really interesting because most organizations, even when we work for large globals, most of us actually work in relatively small teams. So just one individual suffering from effectively mental trauma has a profound effect on the team culture. And then if you times that up, we start to experience individual, team, group dynamic, and ultimately organizational performance. So there is actually a direct correlation between the linkages of a lack of psychological safety, a lack of belonging, and organizational performance. So if organizations do want to tune into their customer base, do want to be creative, they've got to not focus there. They've got to focus on this aspect of psychological safety, and then they get the kind of positive rewards from that, etc.
So really interesting point there. It's not diversity on its own. Yes, we can be as diverse as we want, but unless people feel included and be their full selves, that's where you make the impact. Okay, fantastic. So if we move a little bit more into the research, and I suppose this is where I feel that potentially, as we've been doing this report for a number of years, and we would ask similar questions. And, this is about the world of work. And so let's look at the selection process. Okay, again, and we do ask this question. So 45% of those when being selected say that they believe that there has been occasions where their chance of being selected were limited because of their background or an identifying factor. And that's up, it's up from 36% last year. And when I looked back at the previous numbers, it's not going forward. We don't seem to be making any progress. And I'll talk about within the world of work as well. But are you surprised by that, or do we feel there's a reason why we potentially are not making an impact? Stephen, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think I was surprised by that. And I think also in the research, it highlighted that, people were more comfortable discussing some areas other than others. And I think for me, what was really interesting in that is that one of the areas that they were least comfortable with was sexual orientation. And if you maybe extrapolate those two things, so I would assume now, given all of the strides that have been made over the years and the huge number of organizations that now identified and participate in pride parades, that actually people, say, who are LGBTQ+, may feel more confident in making applications and going through processes. And that's just what you would naturally think from the amount of I suppose, a platform that particular movement has had over the last number of years. And I think certainly I feel more confident as a result of those strides over the last 10 years. But then when we look at actually what people are sort of least comfortable discussing, the area of sexual orientation is the area where they're least comfortable. So there's something happening there. There's something within the organization still that it's still, I suppose, it's difficult for people to approach somebody and ask about their sexuality. And maybe Andrew is correct. I think he's making the point that they shouldn't have to come out. But also, on the other flip side, there's been such a drive over the last, say, 10 or 15 years for organizations to say, we're open and we're welcoming. So I think there's something in those two things that needs to be looked at. And I wonder if, again, it just comes down to that interpersonal relationship. So yes, you might be a Vodafone, and I'm using Vodafone as an example actually because we worked very closely with them in my previous job, and I know just how open and diverse they were. You could be a Vodafone and you could be participating in the Pride Parade, but you might still have people within the organization who feel very uncomfortable speaking to people about their sexual orientation. But the lovely thing in that is what they're probably doing without realizing it is they're making it easier for people who feel maybe uncomfortable about speaking about sexual orientation to show their colleagues who may be LGBTQ+, that actually I'll wear the lanyard, I'll go in the parade with you, I'll walk down the street, I'll still do that, but I'm not going to turn around and ask you, about your partner. So there's something in those statistics, and I think even looking and publishing these statistics, I think is transformational in getting us all to think about why these things exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, what are your thoughts? Are you surprised that we're
I'm not surprised.
Conversation this morning?
I'm not surprised one bit, to be honest. And I think the reason I'm not surprised is because we kind of live in a world full of contradictions and paradoxes, and we go one step forward and two steps back. So it's a very vulnerable thing to do. So most organizations, if I went on to, I don't know, Vodafone or where, if I go onto their website, everybody's talking about DE&I. So we've got the statements, we've got the lanyards, we've got everything on the thing. But if I'm in a particular context, so this is around contextual decision making. So if I'm in a recruitment context, I don't know who's interviewing me. I don't know who those individuals are. I don't know their perceptions on life. I don't know. So I'm in a vulnerable situation. So whether it's about my sexual orientation, my disability, I'm not ready to disclose to them who I am. And that's interesting because it doesn't necessarily mean that I've got a lack of confidence in me. Because actually, interestingly, what the data tells us is a lot of people are out to friends, family, and completely comfortable in society. But we're not necessarily going to show that level of vulnerability straight away in that recruitment context, right? And I think that's the interesting thing. So I think the learning lesson from that then, in that sort of context, is for organizations to be proactive. So to say to candidates, when you're going through the process, and we're used to it with disability, right? So we're used to organizations saying, hey, if you have a reasonable adjustment, let us know so we can make a reasonable adjustment. And I think if you apply that principle through the conversation, I think organizations need to constantly continue to message out, we are a place that, welcomes, values everybody. We value your difference. We respect your difference, whoever you are, wherever you come from, we respect you. And I think the other interesting thing, which is making people nervous, and, we had a breakfast seminar and talked about it this morning, is there is some kind of growing social hostility, actually. So, around, there's a kind of anti-diversity backlash, and there's a kind of I don't know LGBT, but there's definitely an anti-trans movement going on at the moment, actually. And so it makes people feel more vulnerable. So I think in that context, I think organizations need to stop relying on us as individuals to, to Andrew's point, to come out and whatever, and to be much more proactive in those contexts and say, look, we're not even in a way to say, we're not even going to ask who you are, but we're going to proactively tell you who we are as an organization and talk about our values. And hopefully that will give you the confidence to do that. But without that proactive, hey, this is what we stand for, I'm not surprised actually that people are out and comfortable in their private life, but not necessarily in the corporate environment.
Where they are, yeah. And again, I might just go back briefly, Stephen, because again, working with Paralympics Ireland, just that we're talking about the recruitment piece, a recent report from the European Disability Forum found that Ireland's rate of employment when it comes to disability stands at 32.6% versus 51% in EU average. Again, why do you think, what is your understanding of that stats, and what can Ireland do better? We're a big outlier here.
Yeah, I think the first thing in relation to that is that there's a huge opportunity there. I mean, we're at, allegedly full employment, but there's still a huge number of people with disability who for whatever reasons can't find employment. And I think maybe some of that is basically, also down to and maybe the way the social welfare system works. And if a person takes a chance in moving from the social welfare system into the employed world, they might lose some of the social welfare payments and some of the entitlements that they built up and maybe had to battle for as they went along. I mean, just now at the moment, the government has launched a review into how that social welfare system is going to work, and there's pros and cons of that. I mean, I know it's been a little bit in the newspapers recently in relation to what government ministers, the Taoiseach, and indeed when challenged on it, the language around it, and I think the language around it was probably hurtful in some instances to some people, but I think what the drive was to make a fairer system. And I think what we need to do here is to take that drive to make a fairer system, be it in the social welfare system, if that is the case, and bring it into the recruitment and the employment sector as well. And I think just touching back on, I think what Dan said earlier, there's a huge opportunity for talent there and bring in more creativity. When people feel comfortable that they're working in an organization, that they can truly be themselves, they can bring forward better ideas. And I think in that employment area, what we do need to look at is just asking that question, well, why is it a case that people with a disability are still finding it a bit more difficult here in Ireland? And then exploring the reasons around that. And it's okay to say in a company, well, we've maybe never looked at that. So for example, in Paralympics, we recently just employed Jason Smith. So Jason Smith is one of Ireland's most successful athletes ever, most decorated, most gold medals. He's now retired from the sport and we wanted to bring him in. And as bringing him into the organization, we then started to look at, well, what are the areas that we can help Jason with? So we identified that actually, Jason lives in a different area of the country. He travels to Dublin. And when he gets to Dublin, the company can then pay for his taxis without that being a BIK to him, and it's a cost deduction for us because that's allowed. It's there to support people who are blind to get to the workplace. So even as a company working in the area of diversity, there's still things that we can learn when we're looking at trying to make it more possible for people with a particular disability to join us in the workforce. So Jason is now working with us. So I think for other companies, anybody that's on this call today, if you're thinking of, well, what are the areas or who are the candidates? Well, look at what's available and what make it even more possible in your organization to actually bring people who have a diverse background into the organization, and particularly people with a disability, because I think that's a real area now in an area of full employment where there may be the opportunity for real growth.
Yeah, there are supports there. It's just often we don't know where to go for, but it's just reach out to, I think, like-minded companies, Stephen, just to try and understand, get onto the Department of Social Protection. And there are organizations there to support there, but so just for us, and we need to take responsibility for that as well, to do our research and find out what we can do and what is possible to make that happen. Andrew, just again with the Irish Centre of Diversity, I know you do a lot of work around awareness and raising awareness and impacting, like making an impact. Is there anything you'd like to add around the attraction of into businesses and why people might feel discriminated against?
Sure, I can't speak to why they might feel discriminated against. It happens. But what I would talk about is, returning to the point about virtue signaling and turning that on its head. And I know there's been a bit of, as you mentioned, kind of woke bashing in the past or currently, but we would say, companies that are turned on and appreciate and embrace the whole DE&I message should carry on and beat the drum about the great work that they do and really wear their badges with pride. So do have things like the Better Places to Work, our own Investors in Diversity accreditations, have those sorts of things and put them on your websites and on your company stationery and things, and tell people about the great work that you do, because increasingly we're finding that companies want to work with other companies that have those sorts of accreditations and those sorts of shared values, and the best way to promote that you have that shared value are things like the Places to Work and Investors in Diversity type badges that can signal to potential recruits, business partners and other stakeholders about the great work that's being done and that shared value. Around the recruitment piece, I would say, again, that answers that question is really, make sure that you've got your accreditations and make sure that your values are advertised and promoted. And I would go back to what Stephen was saying earlier about the point about, what the findings have shown that still things like LGBTQ status is one of the things that people can't discuss openly. I mean, I find that speaks to me to the need for real cultural change. It sounds like there's while there might be a lot of investment in terms of D&I work within companies and within organizations, it sounds like what's not coming through is authenticity. So it sounds like the work that they may be doing is maybe tick boxing. So they're doing a bit of unconscious bias training here, a bit of LGBTQ plus training there, a bit of support around Pride Month. But then those sorts of values are not spreading through holistically across the year and in a meaningful way that has an impact. So although they can point to things and say, yes, we support Pride and we've got our rainbow colored lanyards, if the cultural change isn't there, if the buy-in from inclusive leadership is not there, then it's all to nothing, really. You can have the best policies in the world, but if they're sitting on the shelf rather than being lived by the people in your organization, then it's money down the drain. I mean, it looks great on a website.
Yeah, I think you said cultural change doesn't come from one-off training. I think you have said before, Andrew. And I suppose,
Maureen,
oh, sorry, Stephen. Yeah,
I might just add in there, and I think that's probably come true in the research as well. 70% of professionals said they felt confident challenging exclusionary behavior amongst members of their team. That means that 30% of people don't. And that's so there's still that area there where, yes, you might walk, and sorry, I suppose it's the easy one that we always go back to, probably because it's been the most successful one, is the Pride movement, is the LGBT movement. And it's certainly one that's inspiring us in Paralympics Ireland to look at how we can try and, drive things on the next decade. But if in an organization, one day you're walking in the Pride Parade, but the next day something happens and 30% of your workforce don't feel that they can challenge that, then as Andrew said, that's money down the drain, and it can be little things. And I think it comes down to another part of the research as well, where it talks about, where people are I think the wording was, they were worried about causing offense. And I think you've got to make sure that those two things are aligned. So if somebody says something that has caused somebody offense, if they fall within that 30% cap, they should be able to say, you told a story in the canteen today. I didn't appreciate that. So there needs to be, and it's not easy, by the way, and nobody is saying it's easy. And for the people on the call today, I suppose it's, don't be disheartened. This is all just human behavior. But I think most of the time people don't want to cause offense. So most of the time, I think if we do feel that we can challenge it, or if we can bring it up in an environment that's safe, I think usually it'll be met well.
Yeah, because if we don't have the conversation, even though it's uncomfortable, we're never going to get change, are we? Or we're never going to be able to drive this agenda. Dan, I think you would agree with that we have to be more vocal, and you might be able to give us some examples of where you've seen this work really well, or
I think you've kind of got the extremes right, and in some ways dealing with the extremes are quite easy to deal with, because if somebody in my organization is overtly racist, sexist, homophobic, in a way it's kind of easy to deal with that extremity, because it's like the conversation's like, you need to leave. Now it's probably slightly more nuanced, because I'll have to go for a HR process, but I'm not negotiating around overt racism or sexism, job done. The problem, I guess, is the gray zone, where if somebody makes a comment or causes a bit of offense is, you know, I think to Stephen's point, I think often people don't do that maliciously necessarily. Most people kind of, and I think, I think if we're honest about it, I think language is becoming much more complex and much more nuanced. And I think, I'm 53, so I'm of a particular generation. And so, the language that I've been used to around LGBTQ, race, even disability has changed over the decades. And so, even as a so-called global expert, I'm prone to error making because I'm not, I'm constantly having to keep up with the language. So if I use a piece of terminology which is perhaps out of sync with modern language, somebody may find that offensive. And what I would really like is for us to have a bit of space in organizations where we can call it out, but we call it out in a supportive way, where we go, oh, hey, Dan, did you realize that, maybe that's something that we don't use anymore, or maybe this is the new terminology. And I think actually what we probably need is a bit of space for people to do that in a way where I can go, oh, I didn't realize that. And you can learn and move on. And I think probably too often is a kind of a, hey, you said this slip of the tongue and therefore you're a bad person. And I think we need a bit less of that kind of hostility actually, and a bit more, space for learning. Because actually what happens is we're human beings. So when somebody says, hey, Dan, you're a bad person, that's like, shit. And then your reaction is defensiveness. You're like, no, I'm not. So I think we end up with this kind of dynamic where people become less confident because of that, and so we back away from it. So I guess I'd like to see a bit more nuance and a bit more space where people can call each other out in a way which is, and we have to call each other out, because if we don't learn. So we can't not do that. I think that's important. But I think we need to do it in a way which is supportive.
No, it's a really important point, because we have to have this conversation. We have to keep talking and learning. Is there any organizations that are doing it really well, even if you weren't to name them, but is there any practical tips? Because I think this is a challenge for every organization, no matter where you are in the journey when it comes to DE&I.
Actually, I will name one. So Bloomberg, interestingly, so I was having lunch with somebody from Bloomberg recently, and they've done a lot of work actually, particularly around the management level, to give managers conversations around how you navigate the complexity of, ED&I. And, they've done a lot of, they probably wouldn't call them workshops, but that's effectively what they were, but just safe spaces for managers to come and say, these are things that make me nervous about ED&I. These are things where I'm struggling. These are the areas which I'd really like to learn. And so I think Bloomberg have done a really good job of saying, this conversation is getting more complex, and let's have some safe spaces for you as managers, because you do need to step up and you do need to challenge, but we want to hear your voice. And I think the reason I'm calling out Bloomberg as a good example is because the managers are predominantly white and they're predominantly men, and they're predominantly people in positions of power, but they're the people that we need to help us on the journey. So giving that group of stakeholders a bit of space to articulate where they're at, I think is quite a creative way to go.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else want to add to that? That's really, it's really interesting, because I think very practically, as I was saying, this is a challenge for every organization, regardless as where you are in the journey. So then if we've spoken about that importance of being able to speak up, there's also, I suppose, taking action, where we are, where we're where there is something. And again, I was surprised, back to my point, are we surprised? Are we not surprised? And how are we progressing the DE&I agenda? But, where there was the challenges around the taking action around the attraction piece, and then the progression of people, their career progression, 46% felt that they, said that their career progression was impacted, again, due to their background or an identifying factor, which interesting actually, the reaction to that and how those people felt as a result, back to I suppose that touched on what we spoke about inclusion. Like, there was really strong words around it definitely impacting their well-being. 90%, 82% angry, 86% powerless. Like, they're strong words. And people, they're working in your organization. And as you said, they may leave But Dan, you made an interesting point that they may not leave, but they're not their whole self.
Right.
So hence you're not, again, that diversity piece plus inclusion, but the inclusion piece is missing.
Well, it's interesting because actually when you look at the data, when people feel excluded, I mean, it depends on the level, obviously, but when you've got a particular form of exclusion or a particular form of like, you know, othering, actually most people don't leave organizations, which is absolutely fascinating. And the data proves this, but what they do is they do feel vulnerable and they do mentally check out. So that's obviously problematic. And they feel that sense of isolation and, you know, that stuff that we've talked about in terms of their mental health. So I think organizations have got a lot of work to do around that particular space. But I think what we need to do actually is thinking about action is learn from science actually in terms of what actually works. So if you look at behavioral science, the work of Iris Benet from Harvard, you know, she's done a lot of work around what practical things can organizations do, particularly around the retention piece and the progression piece. And lots of organizations will do things like mentoring and stuff, but actually her work is focused on things like, you know, micro analysis. So if you do a distinction between, okay, well, how effective is mentoring as an example? How effective is sponsorship? Actually, what she's found is that most of us work in organizations which are highly networked, and obviously relationships matter. So actually, she's saying that if you focus on sponsorship, not necessarily as opposed to, but particularly at career progression, sponsorship effective is much more impactful than a mentoring relationship in terms of career progression. And so we've probably got things that we know definitely have more of a greater impact than other things that do still have some impact and are still useful. So I wouldn't say we shouldn't do them, but I'm saying if we want to have a greater impact, we should focus on things like mentoring. We also, sponsorship, we also do know that having public accountability, you know, to Andrew's point earlier that talked about change, if you as a leader say, I'm going to do something, if you don't tell anyone, well, there's no accountability to that. It's a bit like saying, I want to go to the gym, but nobody's holding you account, or, you know, cessation of smoking. But if I say, Maureen, if I said to you now, I'm going to go to the gym 5 days a week, you'll probably say to me tomorrow, Dan, did you go to the gym this morning? So I've got this kind of public scrutiny, right? And I think if you apply that behavioral science lens to DE&I, we know that saying you're going to do something, saying you're going to do it publicly, puts the spotlight of accountability, and that actually drives action. So I think there's some really interesting things that we know has a greater impact than other things that have more of a, what we might call a softer impact.
And of course, the other part of that, if we stick to the science, is the data. Understanding where we are and who we are, and, you know, what we're sharing to you today is across a number of people, a large group of people, but how does that translate into your organization? So understanding who you are and where the gaps are is really, really important, isn't it? And I know through the Irish Centre of Diversity, we would work with you very closely, understanding our data as we do with other things we do with your voice and diversity data gathering. Andrew, you know, maybe you could share some thoughts around that.
Sure, that whole piece around knowing where you are and plotting how you get there is, you know, that's a core of what our company stands for. So the Investors in Diversity framework, accreditation, which I spoke about earlier, which I have to kind of take a pause almost and congratulate Hayes on being accredited with Investors in Diversity Gold, which is the top tier of our accreditation process. And that really looks at it measures how far D&I has been embedded within the organization, and takes it, when you reach gold, it looks at one step further and looks about the external impacts of that. So how are you taking your D&I actions, what it does to companies and the businesses around you. So sorry, I digress. So that's what gold is about. Silver, Investors in Diversity Silver, is all about that whole how things are felt within the organization. You know, what sorts of effects it has for the people that live and work within the company. So we have it's based around a full staff survey which goes out to everybody, and they answer questions about how the D&I practices are affecting their daily work, their lived experience. And the results from that survey used to kind of take stock on where the company is, where it wants to go, and it then plots about how to get there. And that will be different for every company, because every organization is at a different stage on the journey. And also there are different sectors, there are different sizes, different business priorities. And so there's no kind of cookie cutter rubber stamp that just goes out and can be applied to every company or every organization. Every environment that every organization is working with is going to be different. So
and
it's
hence why
that
it's good to get an understanding of your organization as to where the gaps are, and the tools are there from a data of who we are, but also the cultural, that feeling. I think, you know, that how do your employees feel within the organization, and how engaged they are. Okay.
Really, it's a real kind of microscope as to what your investments are they working, and where can they be improved, and what's to be celebrated.
Yeah, exactly. So your investments, as you said, are directed in the right areas. So then going back to, I suppose we're coming close. If you have any questions, actually feel free to put them in to, I think it's the Q&A function. So, and we can pick those up. We do have some coming in. I suppose the driving change piece then, if we move to that, I suppose, again, only 51% of people managers said that their organizations were proactively taking action to recruit underrepresented groups. And it was similar around career progression, where 45% said they were taking action. Those two numbers feel really low to me, because if you do the reserve of who's not taking action, again, I hate to ask, are we surprised? But why, again, you know, Stephen, you mentioned it, we're at full employment, we're looking for talent. You know, we need it. The pools aren't there, they're not readily there. So there seems to be, you know, there's groups of people here potentially that we could be targeting or trying to engage with in a different way. So why do you think, again, with all the conversations in my years of working in this, and Dan and Andrew similar, I think there's never been more discussion around DE&I. I would suggest it's probably on most companies' agenda now. I appreciate we're all in different stages of the journey, but are we missing something here? Are organizations missing something? Or if they're not, why are they not addressing this? You go for it, Stephen.
I think I'll come in at that one. I think it does feel really low, the 51%. And I think if there's people on the call today that are thinking, look, maybe we should do more, maybe we can do more, I'm guessing that there probably are some companies that are on the call for precisely that. And I think what they need to look at is the statistic that is just slightly below that. Of the 51%, 86% of the people said that they did believe it was working, and 92% of people felt that it was authentic. So in a environment where it's really difficult to recruit, what you really want to do is retain. So if you can retain people in companies, and yes, pay is important, and yes, the conditions of employment are really important, but these areas are maybe just that little 5 or 10% extra for people that said, you know what, actually, I do want to stay here. I'm not going to go, I'm not going to jump from one big four firm into another big four firm, because actually I like it here. They are looking proactively at this area. I do feel that whether it's me or whether it's my colleagues, that they're supported. So I think there's something really, again, positive in maybe the negative of the 51%. So what I would say is the 51% of those people, well done, keep going, you're making a difference. And for everybody else, let's increase it, let's improve it. And I think maybe the reasons why it hasn't been improved, maybe, or the statistic isn't higher, is that everybody is so busy. So organizations are busy. We've had a hard couple of years with COVID. We're working in a different environment, maybe with more people working from home. But if there was some time that could be carved out of the senior management team to really look at this area, I think it'll deliver huge improvements and huge increases in morale because it's very difficult actually in organizations to kind of change. A lot of it might feel, the same old, same old. This can be something new, and it will be embraced. As I said, in the statistics, 86% of people believe that it's making a difference. And if it can feel authentic, which it should, it's going to work. So I think there's a huge opportunity there for the 49%.
Yeah, there is. And the other part, you just said it there, but actually 92% said it was authentic. They felt the company was, they were genuinely doing it for the right reasons. And that's invaluable, Dan, isn't it? To get, to build trust and build the glue, the connection that your employees feel the work that you're doing is authentic.
Yeah, I think Stephen made the good point, actually. Everyone's focusing on the hiring thing, but I think, if we focus on focus on the culture, you'll get the retention. And you get the retention, and most people, if they stay in an organization, generally it's because they like it there. And if somebody likes being there, that spirals really positively in terms of motivation, engagement, and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's where we need to focus, and that's where we'll definitely get the rewards for sure.
Okay, all right. Sorry, Andrew, did you want to add?
I just want to say, I wonder, of the 49% of people who didn't think that their organization was doing something to support the underrepresented, I wonder, is there stuff happening behind the scenes that they're not aware of, rather than the sort of the flag waving and the top line stuff? And, I would almost question that, because our benchmarking data that we've gleaned from our investors in diversity work through working with hundreds of organizations across Ireland, we found that 63% of workers report having had some level of D&I training in the last 12 months. So there is work being done, and I'm sure a lot of that 63%
this was more around minority groups, but yeah, no, potentially. And I think what you're probably saying there is that it's the communication piece that often, and you have to keep communicating at all levels, right down through the all of the business.
Absolutely.
I know from us, it's been one of the big learns through our journey is around how we communicate, what we communicate, when we communicate. As we know, communication can be hugely challenging for all organizations. So it's a really good point, Andrew. So I'm conscious, we're actually coming up to 1 minute. Do we just thank you all, but do you have one final word, Stephen? I think you've probably just summed up there quite quickly.
I just want to say, Maureen, thank you so much. Congratulations on the research, and any of the companies that are here today. If you're already on this journey, then take my hat off to you. And if you're not, well, take my hat off to you in joining the call today, because, this might be the catalyst. So thank you to everybody, and well done.
Thank you, Stephen. Andrew, anything you'd like to add?
I would, the main theme of today was talking about confidence, and I would urge anyone on the call to just don't be afraid of making mistakes. Go back to what I was saying, that they're an opportunity to learn.
Absolutely. Dan?
No, I think everyone said it. I think the only thing I would say is one word is data. I think Andrew made the point, get your data in place, because that can drive action for sure, actually.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Andrew, for your time. Your insights were excellent, invaluable. As always, we're learning. We are on a journey, regardless of whether, as you said, Stephen, you're starting out today, you're on this call, stay on the journey. It is very rewarding. And then for those of us, we just continue to learn. So the report, it's there. There's the slide. You can access it on hays.ie/market-insights/DEI-report. It's a long, but if you should get on the website, and there'll be a link there. Thank you all again for your time. That was a really interesting conversation, and have a lovely afternoon, and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.